Coming up on KCCI 8 News Close Up, a new legal standard for restricting abortion. The block on Iowa's abortion law is overturned. The Supreme Court ruling that dropped late last week, the changes it makes to abortion access in our state, and the mixed reactions. The moments on TV that have everyone talking. We'll have presidential debate highlights from Trump and Biden's first showdown of 2024. And Iowans are dealt another hand of catastrophic weather. As floodwaters overtake northwest Iowa towns, the fight to keep the water out and the governor's tour around flood-ravaged communities.
This is Iowa's news leader. This is KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Welcome to KCCI 8 News Close Up. I'm Chief Political Reporter Amanda Rooker. Well, we have a lot of ground to cover today. We'll be breaking down some of the biggest moments from last week's historic presidential debate. But first, we begin with a major decision out of the Iowa Supreme Court. Iowa's Supreme Court justices reversed a temporary block on the abortion law that was passed last July. That means in about 21 days from the ruling, the law is expected to take effect. That law bans abortion once a fetal heartbeat is detected. Doctors say cardiac activity can be detected as early as 6 weeks of pregnancy, before most women know they're pregnant. In a 4-3 decision, the state Supreme Court ruled that abortion restrictions can be found constitutional if lawmakers have a rational basis for passing them. The High Court sent the case back to district court, but Drake Law professor Sally Frank says this decision is likely final.
The district court will then dismiss the case because the standard is rational basis, and the Iowa Supreme Court has said that the statute meets that test.
The law does specify several circumstances that would allow a woman to have an abortion after cardiac activity is detected. That includes rape or incest if reported to law enforcement or a health provider in a certain time frame. Other exceptions include if the fetus has a fetal abnormality that is, quote, incompatible with life, or to save the life and health of the mother. Under the Iowa court rules, it will take at least 21 days for the case to go back to the district court. Abortion will remain legal up to 20 weeks during that time. Before that decision even came down, groups that support and oppose the law were at the Supreme Court building, both anxiously anticipating this decision. There was an emotional reaction from both when that ruling came through. The Iowa Coalition for Life cheered in the Capitol Rotunda. Meanwhile, leaders from Iowans for Health Liberty struggled to hold back tears. Both groups shared thoughts shortly after the court's decision.
This is a monumental win for Iowa women, for Iowa families, for babies. A baby is a unique and distinct person from its mother.
It's devastating to think about when women come and they are experiencing life-threatening, life-changing complications of pregnancy. What they want are the options in front of them.
Governor Kim Reynolds has defended this ban since signing it last year. She says there is nothing more worthy of defense than the, quote, innocent unborn, and that she's glad the state Supreme Court has upheld the, quote, will of the people of Iowa. The governor added that the state will work to develop policies to encourage strong families, including promoting adoption and protecting in vitro fertilization. She did not specify what those policies would be. Iowa Democrats also shared their reaction to the state Supreme Court's decision. Iowa House Minority Leader Jennifer Comfort called the ruling devastating. She says Iowa Republicans have gone too far and that everyone deserves the right to make their own health care decisions. When we come back, we'll hear from a Des Moines OBGYN on her fears over how the law is written. We'll also hear from someone who helped write the law, and more reaction from the other side on what this will mean for Iowa women. Welcome back to Close Up. We continue with the Iowa Supreme Court's ruling that reversed a temporary block on the state's abortion ban. That law was passed last July. I sat down with a local OBGYN, Dr. Francesca Turner. She's been outspoken in her concerns over the law. I talked to her about how it will affect her as a physician and the way she treats her patients.
Because the law bans abortion after fetal cardiac activity is detected through a transabdominal ultrasound, that could be as early as 6 weeks post-fertilization. Most women don't really know that they're pregnant at that time unless you're actually trying to get pregnant, which over half of pregnancies in the United States are unintended. Typically when women are able to come in and get an appointment, it's a little bit later than 6 weeks. So having an abortion ban that early is going to make it difficult for a vast majority of women. And of course, in the state of Iowa, we have the lowest number of OBGYNs per capita, lower than any other state. So finding an OBGYN and getting an appointment in under 6 weeks is very difficult. When we have this law that bans abortion at 6 weeks, that is kind of medically inaccurate and vague, it's difficult for us to know exactly how to interpret that law. And I'm a doctor, I'm not an attorney. I didn't go to law school, and it's a little bit difficult for me using non-medical language to interpret a law that might end up in me losing my license to practice medicine. I just am looking at doctors in all the other states and what they're going through and the stories of women that are coming forward with where their doctors were saying, I can't help you, or you have to wait. And so we know this law has a chilling effect because doctors are unsure like what they can do to stay within the confines of the law. And so I would 100% ask all of those lawmakers to give me their personal cell phone numbers and be available 24 hours a day so that if concerns come up, any doctor in the state of Iowa can call them and clarify those things. Because that's really what it comes down to, is sometimes medical decisions have to be made very quickly. And do we have time to, how many people do I have to call to say that I can take care of this woman? When standard of care medicine, what we have learned, our education tells us how to take care of this woman. When you are weighing these huge decisions, sometimes by yourself in an emergency room, it is very difficult sometimes, and it is not that clear, and it's very easy for someone to not have their medical license at risk to sit there and say, oh, you should be able to tell.
After speaking with Dr. Turner, I brought her concerns to Republican Iowa House Representative Shannon Lundgren. I spoke to her about how the bill was written and what she wants physicians to know about how the bill is intended, how the law is intended to work.
Once that baby is formed and definitely has a beating heart, it's life. And so we've got to do what we can to protect such a vulnerable human being that can't fight for themselves whatsoever.
Did you talk to, doctors, physicians, lawyers or things like that? How do you make sure that the language of the legislation is actually how it plays out in practicality?
We had worked with attorneys. We had talked with pro-life doctors. We had talked to scientists and embryologists on when they believed life began. And it just made it a pretty easy path for us to make the decision that just like anything else that is living or dies, we detect it with the heartbeat.
Another thing Representative Lundgren pointed out to me that they wrote into this law is that the Iowa Board of Medicine has the sole authority to enforce it. She says it will be enforced by a jury of doctors' peers, not a jury of lawmakers. Now, some members of the Iowa Democratic Party shared their thoughts on the ruling directly after it was passed. Here's what Pam Yoakum, Minority Leader of the Iowa Senate, had to say.
Today's Supreme Court ruling, a very small group of extreme Republican politicians and activist judges have violated nearly 2 centuries of tradition in our state. And that is eliminating fundamental rights rather than expanding them and attacking personal freedom rather than defending it. We stand with the majority of Iowans who support safe and legal access to abortion. This dangerous ruling cannot be the last word on reproductive rights and personal freedom. I hope that Iowans stand up and make their voices heard loud and clear today and from this day forward.
Still to come on Close Up, now that the first presidential debate is in the books, we take a look at what was said by President Biden and former President Trump, and we'll analyze the performance by each one, some of the claims that were made. Welcome back to Close Up. The first general election debate of the 2024 season is in the books. It was defined by personal attacks after President Biden delivered rambling answers and former President Trump countered with falsehoods. Both the Iowa Democratic Party and the Iowa Republican Party released statements following the debate praising their respective candidates. We did ask the Iowa Democratic Party if they had a response to some Democrats calling for President Biden to step down and for a new nominee to be named. They instead pointed to the statement they released, writing, "Tonight, Iowans saw the stark contrast between President Biden's vision for the future, building on his agenda of lowering prices, creating good-paying jobs, and protecting our fundamental freedoms, and convicted felon Donald Trump's plan to give more tax breaks to his billionaire donors at working families' expense." Iowa GOP Chairman Jeff Kaufman released this statement on former President Trump's performance, writing, quote, "It's clear that President Donald Trump was the winner of the debate. Biden has once again shown the world that he is unfit to serve, a danger to our country, and an embarrassment on that stage. With criminals and terrorists coming across our wide open border, gas prices and inflation skyrocketing, and out of control crime, we need to get rid of Biden in November and send President Trump back to the White House." Obvious responses from two parties. We're going to dig a little deeper, though, today into some of Thursday night's key moments. Joining me on set are David Oman, Republican strategist, and Matt Paul, Democratic strategist. Thank you for joining us. A historic debate that, a lot of people left a lot of people talking, particularly about Biden's health. There was a lot of concerns coming into the debate about his age. His goal was to reassure voters, and many feel he did quite the opposite. What was your take from watching that? We'll start with you, Matt.
Well, it was a tough night for the president. I don't think there's any way you can sugarcoat this. The strategy was to do this debate first, to do it relatively early in the cycle in June before we get across the Labor Day marker of really the closing days of the general election, and to reassure people that he's fit and ready to serve another 4 years. What's frustrating is he has had a remarkably successful 4 years as president in delivering for working families, in standing up around the world, and that didn't come through. All anybody is talking about is the performance itself. He, on Friday was stronger in Raleigh at the rally. So for the Biden campaign, they've got to make sure that they show the State of the Union, President Biden, more than they show what happened on that stage in Atlanta last night. And the stakes for them are incredibly high.
Do you think that there's bouncing back from this? I mean, there's a lot of conversation around, can we get Biden out there and show him unscripted, or is this a nail in the coffin?
Well, remember, you've had 57% of the country that has wanted different candidates at the top of the ticket. I think last night just spurs this consideration that folks believe that magically there can be somebody else coming in at the top of the ticket. I think that is going to be hard to do. Nothing in this business is impossible. I've learned that in all these years. But I think the thought of a nominating floor debate in Chicago about a new nominee is far-fetched at best.
David, what's your take on this?
Well, I've watched presidential debates since 1976. Ford, Carter, that didn't go very well for President Ford. Last night did not go well for President Biden. I don't say that with glee. I think it's a fact. We can parse some of the issues that were talked about last night, but the word on the street, the conversation online everywhere is what happened to the president. What changed from the State of the Union to last night? Was he over-prepared? And I'm concerned, and I say this with respect to the office and to the man. I'm not thinking about an election in 4+ months or a transition of power in 6.5 months. I'm thinking about tomorrow. We've talked about national security before. I care deeply about that issue. We're always 24 hours away from a domestic terror event or something going on overseas. And I think we need to know, is the president up to the job? And who's really calling the shots in the West Wing? Is it the president? Is it the vice president? Is it the chief of staff, Zients? Is it the first lady? This is all going to be vetted nationally, and it will ripple down to this state We used to be very much a swing state, a purple state. Of late, we've been a pretty red state. So I'm not sure that what happened last night will change the outcome of the Iowa race in November.
There were a lot of issues. There was a lot of ground covered during that debate. One thing that was new, there were the felony counts that a lot of people were wondering how are those going to be talked about. It was also the first time that we know that these two men had seen each other since
the last debate.
Right, since 2020, and obviously, January 6th was talked about. I want to just play a clip from that moment.
He encouraged those folks to go up on Capitol Hill, number one. I sat in the dining room off the Oval Office. He sat there for 3 hours watching, begging, being begged by his vice president and a number of his colleagues on the Republican side as well to do something, to call for a stop, to end it. Instead, they talked about these people being patriots and great patrons of America.
What they've done to some people that are so innocent, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. What you have done, how you've destroyed the lives of so many people when they ripped down Portland, when they ripped down many other cities. The Unselect Committee, which is basically two horrible Republicans that are all gone now out of office, and Democrats, all Democrats, they destroyed and deleted all of the information they found because they found out we were right. We were right. And they deleted and destroyed all of the information. They should go to jail for that.
The only person on this stage is a convicted felon is the man I'm looking at right now.
So I want to talk to you both about that. Obviously, there was a lot of prep and strategy. You both are strategists going into this debate, telling Trump, don't focus on your grievances. Focus on the substance. There was talk of Biden, maybe trying to get under Trump's skin and talk a little bit about, you heard him. You're a convicted. The only one on the stage, that's a convicted felon is you. So what did you think? Did those strategies pan out?
Well, look, Donald Trump was pretty feisty at the first part of the Thursday debate. That's the normal Donald Trump. As the debate unfolded, I think maybe something clicked on and he remembered what Napoleon said a couple hundred years ago: never interfere with the enemy when he's in the process of destroying himself. That sounds a little harsh, but I think Trump lightened up a little bit, didn't interrupt. He couldn't anyway with the microphone turned off, but he let Biden prevaricate and dissemble, not to the president's benefit. And the president hit on the points that he wanted to make about the economy, about a porous border, and some on national security, which again I think matters a lot.
I do think, President Biden had his challenges last night. I'm not diminishing those. However, I think President Trump missed an opportunity to lay out a vision of where he wants to take the country if he was elected to a second term. As he always does, everything was about him. That's not a surprise. But as we move through the summer, he faces a number of challenges, including a sentencing for these couple dozen felony charges that he's been convicted of. The news cycle is tough right now for President Biden, but these news cycles move quickly. And so the question is, as we move through the summer and people really dial in on this post-Labor Day, how's this play out? And is there a second debate? I think that's a huge question. I don't know that there's going to be a second debate. And I think there's going to be continued attention on Trump's record and this contrast that is going to be very clear to the American people here as we move forward.
David, I saw you there kind of lean in. Was there something that you wanted to respond to there?
Well, both candidates at the debate had one job: stoke up their base, try to show some energy and focus in the future lean, and win over independents. I'm not sure either one got that job done, but Joe Biden went backwards. He did not stoke up his base, and I don't think he brought any independents to his bandwagon.
Do you think that, as a Democratic strategist, if you're thinking through, do we do a second debate? Does it look worse to pull him out? Or do we spend, the next few months really, trying to get him back out on that stage and turn things around? What's the correct advice?
Well, I think this is a really personal decision and difficult conversations that probably happened overnight, probably a sleepless night. at the White House and in Wilmington at the campaign. But these things happen in campaigns. There are ups and downs that happen. But I think we need to see where this data shakes out. Where are voters on this? Where are Americans on this? I don't know that that's clear yet. And I think as some of these issues become crisper, I think that, as we march towards Chicago, there'll be this discussion. But as of today, I just don't see the president. I think the only person in the world that can talk to him about this is his wife, Dr. Biden. And I just don't see any indication that she's ready to have that conversation with him.
And this was already, the polls were showing it to be, almost a dead heat, closely contested. So we'll wait to watch the polls to see if there's any new information of this having, an influence. Well, Matt Paul, David Oman, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Welcome.
Thanks.
Flooding devastated parts of Iowa last week, and more rain is on the way. We'll take a look at some of the challenges Iowans are facing. Welcome back to Close Up. For more than a week now, Iowans have been dealing with catastrophic flooding. High water levels have ravaged some communities as rivers continue to rise. Video you're looking at shows just some of last week's flooding in northern and northwestern Iowa. Many have lost their homes and businesses because of the dangerous amounts of water. Governor Kim Reynolds toured many of those communities last week, offering state and federal aid, and this disaster has claimed at least 2 lives in Iowa. 52-year-old Kyle Crakes from Rock Valley was listed as missing during the flood. His body was found Monday afternoon. According to the police chief, Crakes died after the foundation of his house caved in and a wall fell on him. Crakes' death is the second linked to this flooding event. William Schultz of Illinois was killed last Saturday. His vehicle was swept away in floodwater in Spencer. KCCI is teaming up with the Red Cross to help people affected by flooding in the Midwest. To donate, go to kcci.com/Red Cross. Thank you for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. We'll see you back here next Sunday. Have a great day.